Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Keela Flores with IABC. Welcome to today's panel discussion webinar session, Effective Leadership During and After a Crisis, a global spotlight on COVID-19 and racial justice. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Feel free to submit written questions anytime by using the Q&A or chat boxes. We will go over all questions at the end of the session. Our session today is moderated by Larry Kopp. Our panelists are Edward Davis, Richard Serino, Juliet Kayyem, Sheena Wright, and Lamel McMorris. And now I'd like to turn it over to Larry to get us started.
Task Force 5.
Hi, my name is Larry Kopp. I'm going to introduce our panelists, read their bios, and then we'll get right into the panel discussion. Those panelists, if you don't mind, just mute while we go ahead and read through all these introductions. Our first panelist is Sheena Wright. She's the CEO of United Way of New York City. Sheena recently launched the COVID-19 Fund with support from the NFL, Starbucks, and American Express. The fund is supporting 300 community-based organizations in New York City who are helping communities and families desperately trying to recover from the aftermath of the pandemic. Sheena is the first woman and the first woman of color to lead the United Way of New York City in its nearly 80-year history. Sheena took the reins of United Way the day the Hurricane Sandy hit. She met that challenge and raised $11 million in disaster relief for New York. Sheena has led a transformation of the organization, refocusing UWNYC's support of low-income New Yorkers towards self-sufficiency. Our next panelist is Edward Davis. He serves as founder and CEO of the security firm Edward Davis Company. In this role, he leads a team of security and technology experts, former federal, state, local law enforcement, military officials, and attorneys, all of whom have strong links to academic institutions, governments, and the intelligence community. Ed served as police commissioner of the Boston Police Department from 2006 to 2013, where he led the highly successful investigation of the Boston Marathon bombing. His role was portrayed by the actor John Goodman in the film Patriot Day. The next panelist is Honorable Richard Serino. He has spent more than 40 years in public service. Rich is a distinguished senior fellow at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Rich was appointed by President Obama and served as FEMA's deputy administrator, the #2 role, from 2009 until 2014. Rich has responded to over 60 national disasters while at FEMA. Rich spent 36 years at Boston EMS, where he rose through the ranks to become chief of Boston EMS. Juliet Kayyem is currently a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she is faculty chair of the Homeland Security and Global Health Projects. Previously, Juliet served as President Obama's assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. She played a pivotal role in overseeing the response to the H1N1 pandemic and the BP oil spill. She is currently a national security analyst for CNN. She is also a Pulitzer Prize finalist for her opinion columns in the Boston Globe and the author of the best-selling book, Security Mom. Juliet is the founder of KM Solutions, LLC, which provides strategic advice in cybersecurity, risk management, and infrastructure protection. Our final panelist is Lamel McMorris. He is the founder of Greenlining Realty USA, an urban property redevelopment firm that was launched in Lamel's childhood neighborhood of West Woodland on the south side of Chicago. Lamel also serves as the CEO of the Washington, D.C.-based group Phase 2 Consulting, which he founded over a decade ago. Lamel is the only individual ever to sit simultaneously on the national boards of the 3 largest civil rights organizations in the country, the NAACP, National Urban League, and the National Action Network. He still sits on the board of the National Urban League and the National Action Network today. He also ran Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the platform that launched the nation's civil rights movement. My name is Larry Kopp. I'm the founder and the CEO of the Task Group. Task is a national crisis PR and communications firm. We work mostly with mission-driven organizations and companies with an emphasis on nonprofits and corporate social responsibility initiatives. We've overseen some of the nation's most prominent crisis cases. Some of these include the Trayvon Martin family and their attorney, Ben Crump. We represented Susan Bro, who lost her daughter, Heather Heyer, in the Charlottesville, Virginia white supremacy rallies. We represented Park 51, also known as the Ground Zero Mosque. And most recently, we represented Felicity Huffman in the Varsity Blues college admissions scandal case. We wanted to convene this crisis leadership webinar today due to our work in the COVID-19 space and our current work in the struggle against racial injustice. In the COVID-19 space, we represent the Mount Sinai Hospital here in New York, a city agency also that represents over 43,000 seniors. We've launched recently the Mental Health Coalition with Kenneth Cole, Whoopi Goldberg, Governor Cuomo, and 30 national mental health organizations. And our work on racial injustice includes work with Eagle Academy for Young Men, Harry Belafonte's Gathering for Justice, and other criminal justice reform organizations. So I'm going to get right into it, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to ask you our first question today, and maybe just go around the room here virtually and everyone can answer the first question. All of you here today have been part of defining crises in our history. I want to know what you have learned from these experiences and what types of traits do leaders need to exhibit as our country and the world face the COVID-19 pandemic and its recovery and the struggle against racial injustice. What can you share from your experiences to highlight the types of leadership that we need in these very salient moments? Juliet, I'd like to start with you if I could. You need to unmute, Juliet.
Wait, that's always a good start. Take off your mute button. Thank you, Larry, and thanks everyone for joining us today and the rest of the panel, many who I consider good friends. I'm grateful to be here. So obviously much to discuss about COVID. So I'll just add two things that are sort of challenging from that nexus between operations and communications, right? Because basically communicators need to know operations, right? They need to understand what in fact is going on to be able to relate it in a way to the public, to employers, to employees and workforces that are impacted by this in ways that most disasters are not, right? In other words, they're limited in time, they're limited in scope. And so two things that I've learned, one is that you can never start too early on preparing people for what the next looks like. So we were all inside, all, whining about, social distancing. But I think that there was this misperception that once we got out, right, then then we'll be free or whatever. And I've come to call the period that we're actually in right now, whether it's we're continuing the first phase or it's a second wave, is what I call adaptive recovery. And I think for communicators, that's important to conceptualize. Most recoveries in a disaster, the hurricane comes, the tornado comes, it goes, and then you're in recovery, right? You do response and then you're in recovery. The next year, 2 years, 3 years, and do not hold your breath for a vaccine. I'm a skeptic on all the hoopla news, just to let you know, is we're gonna have to learn to manage with this virus. That's a very hard thing to describe to people. So that gets to my second point, which is how do you describe this period to people, right? Because the way the politics have worked, and in particular employees, but also citizens, but parents who are looking at their kids and wondering when they'll get out of the house and stuff, is the politics have positioned it into two camps, right? The freedom camp and the isolation camp, or the death camp or the life camp, depending on what side you're on, right? And really what it is three factors that hopefully will helpful in ways that I think about it from an operations perspective. So one is what we're trying to do for the next years, because we will be living with this for a while, is minimize, so it's my 3 M's, minimize contact intensity. That is our primary goal here. And this is going to get into the police misconduct protests, right? That, you're kind of weighing things, right? No one can say that was good for pandemic control, but what does it mean to say that it's bad, right? So you want to minimize contact intensity. That means a gym is different than a cubicle. And for employers, it means a cubicle is different than a cafeteria. So you're going to have to make decisions. The second is you want to maintain contact, the number of contacts. So minimize contact intensity. How are you relating to people? This is basic numbers at this game. 500 is different than 50, 50 is different than 5, right? Your chances of getting something being around 500 people or giving it are better if you're only around 5. So that's why we're focused as communicators and planners on we just don't like lots of people around each other just as a, just as a default. But then that gets to the third thing, which I do think relates to the protest, which is if you can minimize and manage, what you want to do is also maximize all mitigation potentials. So that is masking, that is social distancing as a default, that is, for employers, continue to work from home, which I think should be the default for most employers who can do it in 2020. And so those three M's, rather than the camps, that have formed politically, are a way that hopefully help people communicate, why are we making this decision over another? And I think that they also justify and I think support the protests, the other crisis that we're living in, the protests that are going on, that maybe there is something bigger than social distancing, but if you're going to go out, do it in a way that mitigates the harm. So that's sort of how I've been thinking about it.
That's great, Julie. Thank you. Sheena, let me take it to you, because you've launched the COVID-19 pandemic, the fund, community fund, and you're also working to make New Yorkers work for all New Yorkers, and dealing with self-sufficiency and sort of the other social issues that United Way is so attuned to in New York. Talk to us a little about this, about the answer to this question we've just posed.
Yeah, sure, Larry. And maybe to kind of zero in on the part of your question that was focused on what kind of traits do leaders need. I think Juliet did a good job of understanding the contents and the content and, the operationally, but sitting atop any organization, whether it's a nonprofit, a company, a government agency, when I think about this moment and this crisis and reflect on the experience of, Sandy and other experiences, I think there are four traits that are really important for leaders in this moment. One is that leadership has to be distributed. No one person, whatever your title is not going to have all of the answers to what the challenges are. And when I remember my first day on the job was the day that Hurricane Sandy made landfall. I didn't know where the bathroom was at United Way. I was like, what is going on? And so I think very naturally, I just kept asking a lot of questions. I asked people to weigh in, jump in, because there's tons of information that's out there that's needed in order to wrestle through to figure out what is the best response. And even in this instance, one of the things that we're working on, a lot of things as it relates to COVID-19, certainly raising the fund, meeting the needs of communities, but also trying to make sure, and we're looking at everything through a racial equity lens. So for example, one of the big things that we need in order to get back to work is to make sure we have a sufficient amount of contact tracers. So that means when people get ill, there's someone that's calling them, understanding who they've been in contact with, communicating to those other people around, that they've been in contact with, and really trying to understand, the touch points. So part of the work we're doing is saying, okay, who are those people going to be? Are we going to make sure that they're representative? If the communities of color are being most impacted, are we making sure that the contact tracers are coming from those neighborhoods and communities? Are they speaking sufficient languages? Are they going to be credible and trusted? Because if someone is picking up the phone and contacting you, and they want to know who you've been around, and are you going to give them that information? What do we need to do in order to do that? So there's one thing about having a strategy, and there's another about, well, let's distribute how we're collecting data, who we're empowering to solve the problem. So that's one thing. Another thing I'll say is honesty and authenticity. I think it's really important, certainly in this moment, just to be honest about what we don't know. These are knowns and these are unknowns. And there are a lot of unknowns, as Juliet said. There's a lot that we're going to have to be agile about as we move forward. And it's really important for leaders not to pretend that they got the answers and they know everything, and to be, authentic and to be vulnerable as well. I think what's also important in this moment is empathy. There's a lot of fear and concern You know, when I look at my own organization, I was just looking at the data today, 20% of the people on my team have been directly impacted by COVID-19. Either gotten sick themselves, had a family member, we've had several deaths. So we have to just take a moment and appreciate that and give that room and space to breathe and to be and acknowledge the loss and the challenge. And on top of that, right, we have the just, it seems like the every other day killing of an unarmed Black man. And so that has a whole nother set of like post-traumatic stress that's running through many of our organizations, where they're Black people, people of color, and we have to honor that as well as a leader. You can't, it's not business as usual. You can't just rush past it. You've got to honor that. And then the last one is agility. And I think Juliet really talked to the point that we don't know what these next years are going to bring. And if you're one of those leaders that are like, this is the game plan and we have to start here, this is the middle and this is the end, and are rigid, you're not going to make it, because you've got to be able to really turn on a dime and shift strategy and execution, because this is a bit of a roller coaster, you know, and who knows what's next. But I would say those are some traits that it'll be important for leaders to have in this moment.
That's great, Sheena. Thank you. Ed, what are some of your responses? I know you were in the middle of the Boston Marathon bombing investigation and sort of many life and death type situations in your storied career. Tell us what some of the traits and some of the characteristics and some of the learnings that you've gleaned over the years.
Sure, Larry. I mean, when you think back to the Boston Marathon, the most important component of that was that the community stepped up, and both in spirit through the Boston Strong motto and the things that flowed from that, but they also stepped up and provided us with information that was so important to solving that crime. And police departments work best when they have a good, solid relationship with the community. Ours was never better with the community 7 years ago during the midst of that deadly attack. That relationship worked. It gave us the ability to solve the attack and to mitigate the threat. Now the threat is, as it relates to COVID, is very different. It's not one place and it's not one time. It's extending over a long period of time and all across the country. So the challenges I see and the things that the leaders I've been working with, we service a number of Fortune 500 companies that are international in scope, some of them with hundreds of thousands of employees. And as Sheena just said, the single most important thing is cutting through the bureaucracy and allowing these companies to make good decisions on valid data, which we work on providing them, and then allowing them to be agile enough to change as the circumstances change here. I've never seen an event where one day it's, you know, the science and the data says one thing, and a few days later it says something very differently. So we are really moving with the flow of this river, if you will. And so it takes courage on the part of the leadership. It takes transparency and honest communication, as has already been mentioned here. I won't belabor that point. And whether you are running the COVID response or you're attempting to manage this terrible crisis between law enforcement and the community, there are very similar attributes that are necessary here.
Lamel, answer the question if you would, and you know, given your background as a civil rights leader, having worked with Reverend Jackson, Martin Luther King III, and many other leaders across the country, and running a very prominent public affairs agency, public affairs firm in Washington. Talk to us about some of your experiences and sort of how you've seen great leaders and how they perform in these serious situations.
So thank you, Larry. It's been, you know, everything we're talking about, from COVID-19 to, you know, issues around racial justice and social justice. The Black community is disproportionately affected by all of it. And so watching in this community step up especially in COVID, step up with information, taking initiative, making sure that dispelling myths, and everyone has had to adjust, right? Especially when you talk about communicate effectively now in the midst of COVID, in the midst of protests to your constituency. And it's gone to a very virtual platform. I've been very impressed with leaders of traditional civil rights and social justice organizations who have stepped up in a fantastic way to facilitate Zoom, to use all the virtual tools, to convene gatherings, to get elected officials, local, federal, community together. So initiative is part of it, right? And so then on the corporate side, we've seen, again, from COVID to the disruption that is taking place and the protests that are happening and the response to racial justice from COVID to that. And on the corporate side, you know, it's one thing to be empathetic and it's one thing to give good words. But the challenge now for both the leaders in the civil rights and social justice community, those on the higher levels and those on the ground, and corporations, Fortune 500 corporations that are giving, and CEOs who are giving eloquent words. Now it's time for words and deeds to match. When you talk about systemic inequities, whether it's the disproportionate rates that individuals, particularly in the Black community, are contracting and dying because of COVID-19, to the deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, or Ahmaud Arbery, now word and deed must match. And that is a part of effective communication and being, as Sheena said, an authentic leader. And that's one of the great challenges. So it's good, and we applaud the words and the effective communication and folks stepping up. But now we must take very strategic actions that lead to solutions to eradicate. And the more convenings and the more discussions, and by the way, there has to be a significant amount of disruption. Some of the folks that have historically been in the rooms having these conversations have to open up the door and invite some people that they otherwise would not have invited to these discussions. You can't have a real effective and authentic conversation around the disproportionate nature that COVID-19 is affecting a particular community, or watch your businesses be the subject of riots and protests and really talk about racial justice and inequity without inviting some people that may not necessarily wear suits. Maybe some people have some hoodies on. Maybe some people don't necessarily speak the King's language like we do on this panel, but that's the only way that we're gonna move. And so effective communication is not just speaking clearly, but it's also speaking broadly to the largest constituency that we can. And this is part of what we have to do in this climate. And I'm very proud to be on this panel, but we have to begin to continue to match word and deed in a very authentic way, as my fellow panelists have stated.
Thank you, Lionel. Rich, what do you think? I mean, you've overseen 60 natural disasters. You chief of EMS, Boston EMS. I mean, you've been on the ground with Hurricane Sandy. I mean, you've witnessed firsthand some of these instances over the years, and currently with COVID in particular. What are some of your learnings that you can share with us today? You're muted, Rich.
Sorry about that.
There we go. No worries.
I think one of the important things is, as Sheena mentioned, is empathy. And how do we, as leaders, have the empathy? And that doesn't mean just being there. It means being there and actually listening to what people have to say. And then how do you create the opportunity for, have that vision for folks? That you want to be able to not just take charge, steer the ship, but how do you set the conditions for that? How do you set the conditions for your whole organization that they're able to act and learn, and how to do that with some purpose in where to need to go, and how to share that, if you will, sense of purpose. And Lamal, when you were talking about, you know, how to bring different folks together, I remember the story during Hurricane Sandy. And we had developed a group of people not outside of government, if you will, how they could come together during this period of time. and look at innovative strategies to respond. And we have what's called the Joint Field Office, the JFO. And what we did is brought an innovation group with people from all different colors, all different walks of life, people with purple hair, hot pink jumpsuits, tattoos, and they walked into joint field offices. And when they walked in there, everybody was like, oh, who are these people? What are they doing? But what came up out of that group, in a group of FEMA Corps folks, 18 to 24-year-olds, their first deployment, is 34 different ways of looking at problems that we had never looked before at those problems. And that created a completely different way that FEMA operated and how they're able to look and respond to the incidents. So I think it created that shared sense of purpose once we got past what everybody looked like, where they were coming from, but they looked at things completely different and to change. And I think that that's important now more than ever. To how can we take and to break down those silos, as we call them. I say break down the silos, and I'm always corrected from that. I grew up in Dorchester and Boston, and I never knew what a silo was until I got a little bit older. And I talked to somebody from the Midwest and said, well, if you break down the silos, it just makes a mess. What we have to do is connect those silos. There's find ways that we have to connect all those different silos together so we can then be stronger. And I think that that's where we have to go, is create the opportunities to do that. Because once you create and you show the empathy and you have real empathy, you also, people will trust you. And once you trust, and people will then tell you. And I think the ability for one of the key traits, I think, for a leader is to listen and to set the conditions for people. So you can actually hear what people are saying and then take action after that, showing that you will then produce and do and offer substantial change, because that's what's going to be needed. When you said disruptive, I couldn't agree with you more. Is I think we have to look at how we can be disruptive. In doing all that, you also create the opportunity for hope. And don't underestimate the power of hope now more than ever. I think we have to give people hope, to get through the COVID-19, that we know the disparities are causing high rates among people of color there. We also know that we can create hope after these demonstrators, not necessarily protesters, demonstrators. I think that that's going to be essential. We have to create hope all around, and we have to set the conditions for doing that. So I think the way we can do that is to how we can translate a lot of the technical things that are going on, easily digested, and get them out there. And since this is a lot of communicators, it reminds me of during H1N1 with Juliet. I was in Boston and transitioning to Washington. And Rich Besser, and one of the things he always did was, you want to tell people what you know, tell people what you don't know, tell people what you're doing, tell people what they can do, and then also tell people that this is what we know at this moment. But as Ed mentioned earlier, but things are going to change, and more data and information we got to go, our direction's going to change as well. So I think that looking at all these together, empathy, hope, and how we communicate that, honestly.
That's great, Rich. Sheena, I want to direct a question, offshoot a question to you, and which I'd love the other panelists to weigh in as well. Because the word silos, we've talked a lot about silos over the years. And, the work at the United Way that you do is so much about breaking down those silos, or bringing together those silos. But the partnership, building partnerships between corporate America, the nonprofit sector, government, sort of bringing these organizations together to solve large systemic problems like racial injustice or pandemic recovery. How does that work? Well, how do we encourage that unity, that sort of, connectiveness that we need, Sheena?
Yeah, and thanks, Larry. And what's absolutely required in United Way of New York City is unique in that we sit at the nexus. We've got about 100 companies that are partners of ours, 600 community-based organizations, and we also partner with the largest agencies at the city and the state level, whether it's the Department of Education or the Department of Health. And what we know and appreciate is that the challenges that are impacting individuals on the ground, whole neighborhoods, and whole systems are all interconnected. And this notion that there's going to be one agency or one policy or one nonprofit or one, company that has a silver bullet to solve a particular problem, it is absolutely not the case. And so what's required is a coordinated effort, a collective impact network effort. And in order to do that, you have to have a backbone that's helping people, one, diagnose, because there's data, whether it's community-based organizations, companies, government, that needs to be collected. Design a solution that that says, well, which role is each person or each institution going to play? And there's a level of accountability and connectivity. Then you got to deploy resources to the plan that you've developed. And then you have to continually monitor it to see, is it working? Is it not? What are we learning? How do we need to shift? And so that's really hard work to connect silos and be aligned and have aligned action. But you absolutely have to have a backbone and infrastructure to do that. And that's part of what our role is. And then you can get outsized change, outside impact. You can accelerate change in significant ways. And we've actually seen that happening. But it's a new way of thinking and working that we have to deploy in this moment, because the world is upside down and they're really big problems, and we have to be coordinated and aligned to get it to work.
Juliet.
Yeah, so I really appreciate what Sheena just said, and then also just wanted to pick up on what Rich said in response to your question, because I think just this idea that there's no silver bullet. I think that this is playing out in COVID in the way we talk about sort of how does this end, right? So everyone's focused on, as I said earlier, a vaccine. And, not only are there questions about a vaccine, there might be multiple vaccines. We then, as Rich certainly knows, a vaccine never saved anyone, only a vaccination has. We're going to have a massive distribution issue, which is going to raise all the same equity issues that we're dealing with COVID now. Our urban areas, do you do young people first because they're more likely to be carriers, or older people because they're more likely to suffer, right? All these ethical questions. So I wanted to just raise something around leadership in this and this hope issue that Rich raised, because I do think, I think some of the sort of carelessness that we're seeing by the American public, who were most, pretty awesome for a couple of months there. I mean, people willingly stayed inside, and then now all of a sudden we're outside, is to empower them that they have the capacity. This is what a good leader would do, whether in the private sector or an institution or government, to empower people that they actually have the capacity to be a hero. And that is by masking, something so simple that will reduce risk by, a lot. Like literally, as a non-doctor, if you gave me masks outdoors and stay away to the extent possible from major events or rest, sort of continue to social distance, we've gotten 90% of the way there. We can live without a vaccine. And so part of this sort of empowering and hope is, look, this could be a while. That is very depressing that we will live with this virus for a while, but we've lived with other deadly viruses and illnesses like AIDS that has simply changed social behavior, and this is what this might do. And so I think it's just important that we give that even though there might not be a finish line, things will get better because we're getting better. And where politics may fail us, I think other leaders are stepping into that vacuum.
Lamel, talk to me a little bit about how do we encourage corporate America to step up to the plate to address inequity, to address social injustice, quite frankly, to address the pandemic. And, we've lost 40 million jobs since early March. We have an unemployment rate, forget about what the government tells you. The unemployment rate is somewhere between 23, 25%. We had another 1.5 million jobs lost just last week alone. When when the pandemic does sort of abate and we do sort of quote unquote return to normal in the coming months, we are dealing with a transformative moment economically in our country. And by the way, the unemployment rate, the real unemployment rate amongst communities of color are probably 35, 40, 30 to 35%. So how do we appeal to corporate America? You had some very successful work recently with Verizon, but how do we appeal to corporate America? How do we encourage them to be part of the solution? How do we encourage them to step up, as you said, match deeds with words?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I heard a sermon once, and the preacher said, the blessing is in the stretch, when we stretch ourselves outside of our comfort zone. And Verizon is a good example because let's say, you know, like many corporations, when the unrest around the deaths at the hands of the police and inequities, historic inequities around racial justice, they stepped up and they gave a substantial amount of money as a good first step to, let's say, organizations that have a history of working, right, on issues around racial justice and social inequity. But I don't want folks, especially your constituents, to stop there. Because the other thing that you may not know is that as a corporation, particularly their general counsel, Craig Silliman, he has leaned in the corporation on the issue of criminal justice in the most unprecedented way. And you ask, why would a global telecommunications company lean in on an issue like criminal justice? Because if you're really serious about disrupting and repairing systemic inequities, then even as a corporation that's totally out of what your norm would be, you've got to step up and lean into certain issues. This is a global, and it's a very teachable moment for some of your listeners here and the folks that they work with. So, you know, and that, by the way, is not just word. I mean, they are pushing federal legislation. They are convening discussions. They are working with local elected officials and bringing in local leaders. They're bringing in the best thought leaders. And that's what we mean when we suggest word and deed, and Richard suggesting disruption. Corporations have a very unique opportunity because some things, Larry, don't necessarily, even in this critical economic crisis that we find ourselves in, there's still some things that you can do that aren't necessarily and don't always involve money and resources. Leaning in on very critical issues around job guarantees, issues around health inequities, issues around police and historic issues around justice. And by the way, one way to move the needle is to not look outside. There's some movements that can take place that won't cost corporations inside. There's some folks buried beneath who deserve an opportunity to get in some rooms so that when these issues come up, the conversation becomes a little broader. You know, I'm fascinated, and one of the things, I'll make this my last point here, one of the things I'm fascinated about are these issues, and what's gonna rise up right now, especially around diversity and inclusion. I like to think, historically, for the most part, especially in recent years, corporate America and other institutions, they've been very open to diversity and inclusion. The challenge now, and I think I heard Sheena say it, and I wanna emphasize it, the challenge now is equity. And that's the more difficult challenge. Equity in your hiring practices, equity in your giving practices, equity in the issues that you champion and raise, equity in how you move and really share this pie. And that's what you're seeing bubbling, equity around health. You know, Juliet mentioned, I mean, equity around how we're gonna respond from COVID to the disruption in Atlanta, New York, and Chicago around racial justice and racial inequities. Equity, and not just diversity and inclusion, is our next challenge as well.
That's great, Amal. Ed, you wanted to chime in here.
Great comments, Amal, and I agree completely with you. I mean, the inequities stretch across all of our institutions. I certainly know about the criminal justice system but I've also seen it in the hospital systems and the health systems that we have. It's been laid bare by the COVID experience. And even in schools, I visited schools in some of the most troubled areas in Massachusetts, but I've also visited schools in suburban districts, and the inequities there and the differences in the building and the quality of teaching is just palpable. So we need to address that. Going back to corporate America, though, I do a lot of work with top companies, and I know that the easy reaction, the knee-jerk reaction to a crisis, is to throw money at it, to say, okay, let's do this, let's donate to this. This will get us off the hook. This requires more. This watershed moment in American society requires more. And David D'Alessandro, who was the former CEO of John Hancock Insurance, wrote an op-ed in the Boston Globe this past week, and I just reflect back on that. He talked about implicit bias. He talked about the real conversations that happen in corporations about moving people up in the corporation. These are the issues that corporate America has to address. You can throw money at it and blame other people, but until you look internally, as you said, we're not going to fix this.
Yeah, and Larry, if I
ahead,
could just jump in.
Yeah, sure,
quickly.
sure.
I think it's important, and this is a group of communicators, the words and the definition of those words. I think Lamel's point, and really zeroing in on the word equity. Equity does not mean equality. Equity does not mean you give everybody the same thing. Equity is about righting wrongs.
Correct.
It's about fairness and justice. So Ed's just comment about the public school system, right, in Boston. It's important to know that historically, educational opportunities have been systemically denied to communities of color, systemically. Just a month or so ago, in April, in Michigan, the highest court in the state declared that the Detroit school system was systemically denying the opportunity for Black and brown children in Detroit to learn how to read in violation of the state's constitution. This is 2020. So what equity calls for is there's a deep injustice, and that there needs to be an investment, not only of resources, there has to be a righting of the wrong for particular communities where other communities have had the resources that they need and they've benefited. It's about being very specific and targeted in really creating and promoting justice where people have been discriminated against and damaged.
What about this idea? I in one of the cheat sheets I had sent over to the team was this idea of visionary leaders like Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't simply react to the most imminent threats confronting them. They also looked beyond the horizon. They were guided by and guided their people toward their vision for a better future after those challenges had been overcome. It seems like today we're sort of facing these existential challenges every day, another police shooting, another death, another increase in the pandemic. How do we build resiliency in ourselves, in our companies, in our communities, with our employees? And how do we look at that vision in the future? And we talked a little bit about this, but how do we move beyond the current crisis and really envision what the future should look like? And how do we steer communities, neighborhoods, corporations, governments, and organizations in the right direction? What are some of the experiences you've all had in the past in that regard? Rich, go ahead.
A couple of things. I think one of the first things you have to do, as I mentioned it earlier, was listen. I remember just first going to FEMA. If you remember the FEMA after Katrina had another F in front of it, how people referred to FEMA. They used to say that's how people referred to FEMA everywhere. And one of the things is actually had to go around and listen to what people had to say all over the country. And I think that on much larger scale is you have to do that. And you have to hear what people have to say in creating that. And I think as you start to do that, you have to also develop a construct. And one of the things we talk about at Harvard at the NPLI is idea of swarm leadership, creating that unity of effort, everybody understanding where we want to go, having that generosity of spirit, making sure that you're able to help each other out, staying in your lane, doing what you need to do, but now broadening out and bringing those people together, and not having, which we see a lot of now, no ego, no blame. And then once we have that, establishing and hopefully having that foundation of trust and relationships. And in the business community, taking that opportunity now to say, how can we do that? And the thought comes up is in Boston, Mayor Marty Walsh said racism is a public health emergency. COVID-19 is a public health emergency. We all know that they are tied together. But now looking at that, what can companies and corporations, large corporations, some smaller ones do is establish, if you will, a public health officer within your company, and how you can take that and expand what they need to do. So I think having not just the vision, but able to actually execute that vision in moving forward and bringing the different groups of people together.
Juliet, good.
So just quickly, thank you. So anyone who has kids of a certain age, maybe a little bit older, so crankier, but knows this is a challenge for parents as well, which is how do you get your kids to reimagine what they thought their life was going to be like? Especially, I want to focus on COVID, just in the sense of, what college means, right? So for those of us with kids at residential colleges, or even what high school means, and sports being canceled. And it's really hard. I've gotten to, when I'm in a bad mood, I say, 2020 sucks. When I'm in a good mood, I say, reimagine 2020, that's the way to think about that it's neither good nor bad. It's just a way of reimagining the way we live, the way we parent, the way we get educated or educate. So there's three things that just on this resiliency side that I think are helpful from the leadership and communications perspective. I think the first, just given the world we're in on COVID, just as I said, I'll focus on that, is you don't want a single point of failure. This is how we build systems in the security world. We call it layer defense, right? You don't want, the generator in the hospital, you don't want it, you don't want there to only be one. You don't want a single point of failure. And I think that's the way we have to think about building our own resiliency, and institutions' resiliency, and a community's resiliency. The second is you want to build in for resiliency a capacity to pivot. I mean, we study what Ed did in my class on the Boston Marathon, that a public health apparatus that was waiting for blisters and exhaustion and dehydration, was able to pivot because they had trained to pivot and built in resiliency, right? I mean, in other words, Boston Strong isn't an attitude. It's the fact that, I guess, only, 3 people perished at the finish line, but close to 300 who were really injured did not. And that's a sign of success. The third is building in capacities to learn. I think this gets back to Lamel and Sheena's points as well as Ed and Rich. It's just, you have to, because we don't know how this unfolds, we're going to have to learn in real time, because we're learning about the virus in real time. So you have to build in your adaptation into leadership. In other words, there's no quarter system anymore. You can't talk about Q3 if you're in a business, right? You're talking about next month, right? And you build in that capacity to learn, because next month we're either going to have a massive outbreak, or, as the case may be in Boston, we've clearly are on the other side of the curve. So that's just ways to think about building resiliency into the system itself.
Ed, let me direct a question to you. I watched the Atlanta police shooting again, Mr. Brooks, Rayshard Brooks, yesterday. Again, these things just keep happening. I know you and I have had some very candid conversations about the Boston Police Department. Under your tenure, a lot of those things weren't happening. You seem to build a department that was much more responsive to the community than many and most urban police departments across the country. What do you see that's going on? How do we build stronger relationships between the community and the police department? And what do both communities need to do to work together to forge a stronger partnership in these issues moving forward? I've been very moved, by the way, by police departments across the country kneeling, for example. That was a very moving experience. What are some of your experiences there?
Well, Larry, thank you. I was sick yesterday when I saw that encounter with Mr. Brooks. I watched the whole 40-minute tape, and another example of something that we saw up in Minneapolis. It's just unconscionable what happened there. I don't understand how we get to the point of using fatal force in a situation like that. This man was more than respectful. He was deferential to the officers until the arrest. So there's got to be another way out of those things. But to answer your question, Boston has a great reputation of using community policing. It existed before I got there. I pushed it really hard, and I got cops out of their cars. I got them doing different ways to respond to, we had bad, serious homicides that occurred that had to have a police response. But instead of going in and just waging war against everyone in the community, we went in and asked for their help. We didn't give them tickets. We didn't arrest them. My arrests dropped every year for 7 years. My total number of arrests dropped because of a new way of looking at this. It's not just me. I have a bunch of colleagues across the country that committed to community policing. We got away from that after 9/11. We got away from that when all of these, when these different court decisions came down. The protections that the unions give to police have to be revisited. And we talked about actions and not words. We need to require that from our legislators on that particular front. But there is a way to provide better policing. If you open the doors up to a police department, the community will come through. I've hosted dinners with people from all over the world, immigrants that came in and sat down with police officers and talked to them. These are human systems. We're making cops into robots right now. They're becoming warriors and law enforcers and not police and peacekeepers. And that's really what we need to focus on to fix this.
Thanks, Ed. We only have about 5 or 6 more minutes. I'm looking at questions. Sheena, one of the folks here asked about backbone. What do you mean when you say backbone? When you were discussing the idea of silos and building connectivity between nonprofits, government, and corporations.
Sure. Backbones are typically institutions whose job is to be an intermediary across other institutions and sectors. And so United Way of New York City is a backbone, and we are connecting nonprofits, government agencies, and companies. And so part of our job is to weave the networks. So we convene and support the convening of meetings. We collect data so that all of the people who are stakeholders can look, synthesize, analyze the data, and we help guide the body, the collective, in making a decision about what to do and designing an approach. So it's an institution or an organization that can cross boundaries, right? Can talk the language and has authenticity, whether it's in community, whether it's in a corporation or with government, that can, that is trusted. Backbones need to be trusted across sectors, and that has the kind of the analytic capability to kind of look at all the pieces of the puzzle and start to connect them and to enable others to really connect with one another. And so we have a team, we have a community building team, we have issue-specific area teams that are out in these 3 sectors, really helping be the glue that pulls it all together.
Thank you for that. Let me just go around the panel here. And if you could just give me 1 or 2 individuals that you have been inspired by in terms of the way they've led through these 2 crises, one or the other, or in some other in your past, maybe some other incident that you were engaged in. Let's start with you, Rich. Again, let's go around the room. 1 or 2 individuals, what their names were, what role they played, and why were they inspiring to you?
Well, one that I know Juliet and Ed are familiar with, and I think others as well, is during the marathon bombing, is how Governor Patrick handled that situation as a leader, is how he was just listened, took information, let the professionals do their job, and just gave overall direction. And Governor Patrick had done that consistently, but in that moment, he never got upset. He just sort of kept a level playing field across the board. Being in the room with him and Ed and everybody else during that period of time, I think it was something that stuck with me and has stuck with me since then.
Lamel, what would you think? What has been your experience?
Yeah, during this season that we're experiencing, and from COVID to issues around racial justice and racial inequities, I've been very impressed, I must say, with the governor of New York, showing leadership, transparency, and in this context, and for our purposes today, effective communication and authenticity. He is someone that I don't know, but watching him from afar, he has inspired confidence and what some said today, hope, but especially good information. And that is the kind of leadership we need. And he's shown, by the way, not just empathy, but one of the themes that is being echoed from the streets right now, to value my life. That's all we're asking, for lives to be valued.
Sheena, what are some of your experiences?
I would completely agree. I think Governor Cuomo has been exceptional in this moment, along with other governors across the country, but he has been exceptional for all of the reasons Lamel mentioned.
Juliet, what would
I'm going to give a shout out to the mayor of San Francisco, Lennon Breed. And the reason why is leadership is sometimes communicating, but it's often listening. And when the history of this is written, what she did early on, many will remember she closed down San Francisco much earlier than even the NBA or any other city. And why did she do that? It was because there was a Chinese New Year festival in San Francisco that that her team noticed it's not that crowded this year. And so they started talking to members of the community and leaders in the Chinese community and heard about their fears about this virus that their family members in China were dealing with in Wuhan and the rest of China. And you know, they were their own intelligence network. And she heard that and realized she was missing something, and then began to investigate and then realized that they had community spread and shut down San Francisco early. And the successes in San Francisco, as compared to, say, New York City or what we're likely to see just horribly in Arizona and Florida in the weeks to come. I think that listening, I think, is really important as well from different community members, not just her team, but others.
Yeah. Amen to London Breed and Adam Silver, the NBA too. Amen.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Ed, what do you think?
I agree with Governor Cuomo. That was the first person that came to mind. He's been doing such a great job and has been so transparent. You feel better after you listen to him. And it's such a stark contrast to what we're seeing at the federal level. You know, Rich mentioned Governor Patrick. He was tremendous to work with. I also had the honor of working beside Mayor Menino. And we used to have conversations about the importance of mayors in the government right now. They seem to be the ones that have the best experience, the ones that understand things better than anyone else because of their contact with the community. And so two mayors, the mayor in St. Paul and the mayor in Atlanta, have very much impressed me in responding to these terrible situations that are occurring. They're logical, they're concise, they're honest, and they're demanding change, and you can't ask for anything more.
Thank you, Ed. Well, we've reached our time, and I wanted to say thank you to all five of you, who, by the way, in my opinion, are outstanding leaders in of themselves. You, all five of them, inspire me every day. So thank you so much for being a part of this panel today. Yeah, I wish I could read all the chats that have come through. There's hundreds of chats of just very positive reinforcement and appreciation. So thank you so much to all 5 of you. And we've reached our time, and I think that's about it. Keela, you coming back on now?
Thank you.
Yes, Larry, thank you so much. And thank you so much to all the panelists today for sharing your expertise. This has been incredibly invaluable during this time of need. And just to remind everyone, there has been a couple questions. We will absolutely share the recording and potentially get you everyone's social media links, as people have asked to follow all of you through your challenging times as well.
Please send me all of your social media links, all the panelists. Email them to me, and we'll make sure we get them sent out to the group.
Yeah.
Will do.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.